The interior of the house was dark and silent. Sarah, the young woman, liked the peaceful atmosphere of being at home alone. But tonight was different. A storm was approaching, and raindrops were hitting the windows as the wind whipped outside. Sarah was relaxing in her chair in the living room. While he was taking a few hours to read his book, suddenly the lights of the room started flashing. For a moment he thought that the power might have been cut off, but at that time he realized a terrible fact. If the electricity had been cut off outside due to the storm, the streetlights would not have been lit either. But the lamps outside seemed to be on. Sarah continued to watch the flashing of the lights with a shudder inside. A moment later, he heard a high-pitched scream from one end of the room. In a panic, he got up and tried to turn off the lights, but the keys slipped from his hands and fell to the floor. At that time, strange sounds began to come from all corners of the house. The walls were shaking, the doors were creaking open and close. Sarah took out the phone in her hand and tried to call 911, but the phone was not picking up. Suddenly, a figure appeared decked out among the darkness of the room. Her face was covered, and she was wearing a long dress. Sarah watched the figure with fascinated eyes. The figure came closer and turned around him and began to speak, but his voice was strange and incomprehensible. Sarah, in a panic, wanted to leave the room, but her feet wouldn't move. Suddenly, the figure's face opened up and slowly began to take his face. Sarah gasped, awaking from the horror of the moment. At that moment, the room's lights started flashing and the storm outside seeped into the house. Sarah was still shuddering because the decoupling between reality and dream had become indistinct. Sarah, the skirts of her dress slightly creeping on the floor, stood quietly in the middle of the living room until she heard any noise. The lights were still flashing, and the sudden flashes that lit up the room created an uncomfortable atmosphere. He started walking in the direction from which the sounds came. The walls were shaking, the furniture seemed to be moving on its own. Sarah passed in front of a mirror near the door and looked into the mirror for a short time, but the mirror did not reflect his face. Instead, it looked like the reflection of a woman who was on her way to leave the room. Suddenly, the figure that had appeared opposite Sarah reappeared. He was dressed, and his face was hidden. The figure approached and held out his hands without waiting for Sarah to turn to him. Sarah felt the touch of the figure, and a cold chill ran down her neck. Sarah tried to talk to the figure, but the figure was again speaking in an incomprehensible language. He ran quickly to the door so as not to stay any longer. The door was slammed by the wind and locked quickly behind Sarah as it closed noisily. He was now in a dark and silent room. The lights were burning steadily, and there were no flashes illuminating the room. Sarah tried to open the door but failed. Figures appeared all over the room and surrounded Sarah. Sarah gasped, waking up screaming in the embrace of these terrifying figures. When he looked into the room, the lights were still flashing, and everything was normal. However, his nightmare was still under the influence, because the boundary between reality and nightmare was becoming more and more unclear every moment. Deck. Sarah sat and looked around anxiously for a while longer before returning home at the end of that night. Suddenly, the lights came back on and the room was empty. Melissa felt like she was in a strange dream. But was it a dream or a reality? A dark secret was still hidden inside the room. Alice was alone in the house. It was past midnight and the rain was pounding on the window panes. The television was turned on quietly, providing a slight light inside the house. Suddenly, Alice heard a click coming from the kitchen. His heart began to beat rapidly. He got up quietly to see what was going on in the kitchen and opened the door slowly. The kitchen was empty, but he had a feeling that something was wrong inside the house. When Alice returned to the living room, the TV had been turned up and the screen had gone dark. An old camera standing next to the TV was on the countertop, and flashes were going off as if it was working by itself. In fear, Alice quickly turned off the machine. Suddenly, As the silence in the house relaxed Alice, she looked at the wall next to the mirror. The mirror was empty without its reflection. Alice, slowly retreating, approached the mirror and felt through it that something was wrong. Just then, something came out of the mirror. A huge hand reached out from the surface of the mirror and moved closer to Alice's face. Alice screamed and gasped, waking up at that time. However, the line between reality and nightmare was so deceptive that Alice no longer felt safe in her own home. Emery was alone in her house one dark and stormy night. The power was out, and he was trying to light it with candles. While sitting in the light of a candlestick, he began to hear strange sounds. At first, he thought it was the effect of the wind, but the sounds were getting closer and closer. Suddenly, he noticed that the door opened slightly, and a shadowy figure appeared. His heart began to beat rapidly. He knew that he was not alone in the house. Emery gathered her courage and approached the door. But there was no one behind the door. There was just a dark hallway and those strange sounds. As he approached the end of the corridor, he saw a door opening into the room. The door was quietly opened, and he entered the room. He found a notebook full of mysterious symbols and writings in the room. Suddenly, a voice forced him to turn around. There was a painting hanging on the wall of the room, and the painting started to move. The figure in the picture came out of the painting and started walking around the room. Emery started to run away in fear. But every time he went into the room, the strange figure was following him. Finally, the figure approached him and surrounded Emery. Emery's voice stopped, and she woke up before she could go back into the room and look. However, those mysterious symbols and writings were still in the notebook. Was it real, or was it just a nightmare? Emery was no longer quite sure. Melissa was alone in the house. Outside, the air was beating wildly with a terrible gale, and the hum of the wind was wafting around the house. The power was out, and he was sitting by candlelight. Suddenly, he heard a rustling. Melissa approached the window and pulled aside the curtains. Outside, the branches of an old plane tree were fluttering in the wind. She drew the curtains again and sat down. But the rustling did not return. The silence of the room created a terrible atmosphere. Melissa tried to relax and decided to buy a book. But as soon as he took the book in his hand, he noticed that other items on the shelf were moving. Melis, with her heart bursting with fear, put down the book and quietly decided to leave the room. But the door did not open. As I was pushing the door in a panic, something started moving inside the room. The room was filled with darkness, but Melissa's eyes met the eyes that lit up the room. A shadowy figure glimmering in the darkness. Melissa trembled with the fear of death. Suddenly, the lights came back on and the room was empty. Melissa felt like she was in a strange dream. But was it a dream or a reality? A dark secret was still hidden inside the room.